Oh my gosh, Paimon, let me breathe! Ayos! Clipper here, and welcome back to another study session. So last time we picked a couple flowers and started talking about the Statue of the Seven. Today we're hopefully actually going to get to the Statue of the Seven.
너도 알다시피 언어와 노래는 바람을 통해 전파되잖아. 그 중에는 반드시 여동생의 소식이 있을 거야. 당연히 신의 응답을 받을 수 있는지는 시험해봐야 알 수 있어. 그럼 빨리 가보자.
Alright, cool beans. So Paimon opens up with this phrase, 너도 알다시피, and turns out this means, as you know. Technically, you can actually add the 다시피 ending to other verbs, but more often than not, this is how we'll see it used. And today, it seems like we know something about 언어와 노래. So 언어 is language, which is very important when you're in your settings, and 노래 is like music or song. This wa in the middle here is used as and, specifically for linking nouns together, and in general it's perceived as a rather polite way of saying and. So 언어와 노래, language and song. Next up we've got 발음을 통해 전파되잖아. 통하다 is kind of like to move through or to flow through, and so 발음을 통해, flow through the wind. Now I'm gonna jump ahead to this little 잖아 ending over here. So this ending is used to assert a point, especially when it's something that someone really should know, and it turns out it actually pairs really nicely with 알다시피 up here. In fact, preceding 잖아 with 알다시피 actually makes it a little bit more polite and kind of helps to reduce any told you so energy that it might have on its own. So altogether, 너도 알다시피 언어와 노래는 발음을 통해 전파되잖아. It's gonna be, as you know, language and song are spread through the wind. Moving on, we've got 그 중에는 반드시 여동생의 소식이 있을 거야. So starting with 그 중에는, we've seen 중 before used as middle or between. So 그 중에 is kind of like among those or between that. And here Paimon is probably referring to language and song. Next up, we've got 반드시, which is kind of like certainly. So 반드시 있을 거야, they'll definitely have. And it looks like they're gonna have 여동생의 소식. So soshik is kind of like news or information, so I like to think of this bit as news of your younger sister. So throwing all the pieces back together, Paimon's kind of going, between that, they'll certainly have news of your younger sister. And just a quick reminder that even though Ether and Lamine are technically twins, they seem to have a very older brother, younger sister kind of dynamic. So moving on to the next bit, I'm gonna start with this first half. 당연히 신의 응답을 받을 수 있는지는. So right now, I'm just gonna focus on 받다, which is like to receive or to get. Also, since this 는지는 ending isn't followed by 모르다, I'm thinking of it more as whether, like whether or not. So I'm reading this first part as whether we can get an obvious answer from the god. Next, we've got 시험해봐야 알 수 있어. So 시험하다 is to test something, and in fact, just 시험 on its own is a test. And then this aya ending in the middle here expresses that we must do A in order to do B. It also kind of works to think of this as only if. More often than not though, you'll see this as 야해 or 야돼, which both just mean that you have to do something. So I'm reading this part as we can only know if we test it out. So putting everything together, whether we get an obvious response from the god, we can only know if we test it out. Then we end off this little section with 그럼 빨리 가보자. So 빨리 is just quickly, and you'll hear this a whole lot while you're getting ready for school in the morning. So I'm kind of thinking of this part as, so come on, let's go see.
바로 헤엄쳐서 오면 돼.
Okay, interesting. So for 바로 헤엄쳐서 오면 돼, I'm gonna start with 헤엄치다. So this means to swim, which actually kind of threw me for a loop because growing up I remember hearing 수영하다 as to swim. And unfortunately for us, it does seem like there is a difference between these two. So from what I understand, 헤엄치다 has more to do with the actual movement of someone in the water, and it can be used for both people and animals, whereas 수영하다, on top of just being used for people, depending on who you ask, it can be anything from the actual sport of swimming to just kind of being in the water, so it's a little bit more loose in translation. And then moving on to this 면대 ending, this is kind of used to make a suggestion. So altogether, Paimon's going, you can swim right over. Ooh, Sealy. No, I really shouldn't. I should get back to practice. I just can't leave it. I'm easily seduced by the alluring calls of box. Hold up. 캐릭터 화면 열기. Okay, see what this does. 성유물 장착, so that's just equip relic, don't worry about that part. I won't be covering the specific names of the artifacts or their lore today, but if I get a full set, maybe I'll do a separate video on the specific set's lore. Let me know if you'd like to see that. So this first artifact falls under the category of 죽음의 깃털. 죽음 is death, and then 깃털 is feather. So this is kind of like feather of death or death feather. Sounds like my metal band in high school. And then for this artifact, we've got 시간의 모래. 모래 is sand, not to be confused with 모레, which is the day after tomorrow. I love this language. So, 시간의 모래, sands of time. Hey, it's our first place name. 별이 떨어지는 호수. So, 별 is star, and then 호수 is lake. I think in English this was Starfell Lake, and honestly, that works well enough for our purposes. Huh? Ooh, map time, let's go. So since we just learned hosu, I'm gonna start off with shideru hosu, which is obviously cider lake. Technically Korean does have the word saida, but it refers to 7-Up and stuff instead of actual cider. And then down here we've got the city of Mondstadt, or as they have it translated, Mondesang. And I actually looked it up, and it turns out one of the meanings of sang is either castle or fortress. So if I start referring to Mondstadt City as Castle Mond, you'll know where I got it from. And then over here we've got 속삭임의 숲. 속삭임 is kind of like a whisper, and then 숲 can refer to either a forest or the woods. So in English, this was Whispering Forest, I believe. I like to read it as Woods of Whispers, but that's just me. And then up north, we've got 바람맞이 산. So one of the meanings of 맞다, among many others, is to be struck, and then 산 is like mountain. And one of the translations I got back from this one was windswept mountain. I kind of like that. And then over here, we've got 바람맞이 봉우리. Turns out 봉우리 is kind of like a peak or a summit, so windswept summit. And then moving down south here, we've got 별을 따는 절벽. So 따다 is kind of like to pick or to pluck, and then 절벽 is like a cliff. In English, this got localized to Star Snatch Cliff, and honestly, that's good enough for me. Then down here, we've got 천풍신전. So 천 means 1,000, and this one is very important to remember, especially if you're counting money. And then I'm guessing 풍 comes from 폭풍, which means storm. 신전 is kind of like a temple or a shrine. And whereas this got localized into English to Thousand Wind Temple, in Korean it's more like Thousand Storms Temple. And then this entire area is called 별이 떨어지는 산골짜기. So 산골짜기 is kind of like a ravine or a gorge. I think in English this got translated to Starfell Valley. That also works. And unfortunately, I am gonna have to cut it off here. I genuinely hate where I'm cutting this off, I'm not gonna lie. I wanted to get the next sequence into this episode so badly, I even considered cutting a lot of stuff out of this one, but ultimately I decided that since the next sequence is just so dense and there's so much in it, I would rather have it in its own thing. So if today seemed a little bit filler, it's because it is. That being said, thank you so much for joining me on my little learn-along, I guess you could call it. Take care, and I'll see you across the ecliptic, which should hopefully be soon, we'll see how it goes. Anyways, bye-bye!